My name is Karen Fabian, and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about one of the muscles in your hip called the piriformis. And just to give you kind of an idea of where it sits, your piriformis runs from your sacrum to your femur. And generally speaking, so you can kind of think of it as resting like this. Generally speaking, when muscles contract or do the action that they're designed to do, the insertion moves closer to the origin. Now that's not a hard and fast rule because sometimes things can go the other way. But for the most part, when we talk about concentric contractions of muscles, we're talking about insertion moving closer to origin. So in this case, running from sacrum to femur, if the insertion moved closer to the origin, the femur would move closer to the sacrum. And the action you would get as a result of that is external rotation. So if I take my feet and I turn them out, and you can kind of go back to imagining where the muscle sits, as I turn this out, this moves closer to this. So insertion moves closer to origin. And that's the concentric contraction action of the muscle. So if I take my feet and I turn them out, kind of like coming into a yogi type squat, or any position where one of my hips is moving into a little bit of external rotation. So even here, you have external rotation in the hip here, or if I come into half moon, this hip is open. So in all those positions, the hip is in external rotation and the hip is opening up. That's kind of our yoga speak, right? However, there are some other shapes where you might hear the teacher say, this is a good posture to stretch your piriformis. And it was one of those things that I had heard years ago, and I thought, how can that be? Because many times I would hear it when doing figure 4. And so figure 4 pose has the hip in external rotation. So if you know anything about anatomy, you might be thinking, well, gee, how can the piriformis be stretching when the hip is in external rotation? Because what you would assume, based on what I just shared, is that external rotation is the doing of the movement. So in that case, the muscle would be shortening. So this is where things get kind of interesting, and this is one of the features of muscles, right? So muscles, when we study them, we oftentimes focus on their primary action, but they also do other actions. And additionally, depending on the position of the limb, their line of pull can change. And so I was kind of refreshing myself on the research out there about the function of the piriformis, and I just wanted to share with you kind of a fun fact. And that is, when the hip is in 0 degrees of flexion, meaning the leg is just straight, there's no flexion at the hip, the piriformis, as I showed you, indeed acts as an external rotator. And so as I open the hips here, the piriformis is doing its job, concentrically contracting. However, as I start to flex my hip, so I can do that like this, or I can do it like this, or I can do it on the floor in figure 4. As the hip comes into flexion, the line of pull of the muscle changes, because now I've lifted my thigh up. And what ends up happening as the hip moves into flexion is the line of pull of the piriformis makes it more so that we're moving in this direction rather than that direction. So the line of pull changes and it turns into an internal rotator, but only when the hip is in at least 45 degrees of flexion, and here this is 90 degrees of flexion. So that's why as I bend at the hip, as I flex the hip, the piriformis in this position is an internal rotator, and I'm opening my hip or externally rotating it, so therefore I'm doing the opposite of its function while the hip is in that position, so I'm stretching it. So this can be, somewhat confusing. I think as you're starting out as a yoga teacher learning anatomy, it's really good to kind of frame how and what you're learning. So generally speaking, what I like to do with teachers is give them the name of the muscle, get them used to kind of the name of the muscle, where the muscle is, generally speaking what the origin and insertion is, and then what's its concentric action. So for instance, my signature program for teachers to learn anatomy is the Blueprint Learning Program. And in that, by the time we get in the course to the muscles, I present to them the muscle, generally the origin and insertion, and then the primary action or concentric contraction action of that muscle. And I think that's a really good place to start, because then when you start to look at poses, you can start to speak to what muscle is doing what, because you're focusing on the muscle's role as a doer, which is, in anatomical terms, the agonist. It's doing the action. It's concentrically contracting. The fibers are moving closer together. And then over the years, going forward, you can pick up all these other pieces of knowledge. But it's so important, because anatomy is such a big topic, to have a place to start. And so I want to frame it for you in that way, especially if you're feeling overwhelmed, which is a really common feeling. So again, in my Blueprint Learning Program, I frame it for teachers so that throughout the program and the live coaching calls we do, they have somewhat of a perimeter around this big topic, and they can come out as a graduate of that program really feeling confident around a lot of the fundamentals and then some. And then you've got, you know, all the rest of your teaching career to dig into other things like this. So I'm recording this on April 14th. And this week I have an offer open just for this week for a class for beginners. So it's more for teachers, but it's how to teach beginners. So I'm going to include that link here. And then also on the 23rd of this month, April 23rd, 2020, I'm going to be doing a live workshop on hip anatomy. And so I'll include the link to that as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I'll also include the link to my Blueprint Learning Program waitlist, so you can be one of the first ones notified the next time I do a live launch and open enrollment for that course, because it's not open all the time. I launch it several times throughout the year, and I support the teachers and then graduate the teachers and then do a new enrollment. So I hope you are well. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next video. Namaste.